Thank you for joining us here in the Ken Olson Center, or otherwise joining us on the Gordon College live stream, where our audience around the world is able to participate in the debate. Welcome to Gordon College. My name is Paul Brink, and I am the co-director of the Jerusalem and Athens Forum here at Gordon, and this is our 18th annual debate. Yes, thank you. Many of you will know that the JAF debate has become something of a spring tradition here at the college, often as a way to kick off our annual symposium week, which we are doing this year again. I have just a few preliminary things to say before we get down to business. The topic that we are considering tonight is a vital one for an institution such as Gordon College, rooted as it is in the Protestant evangelical tradition. Although neither Roman Catholicism nor Eastern Orthodoxy should be seen to be monoliths, the fracturing of the church into many denominations has been a hallmark of Protestantism in particular. Meanwhile, many denominations themselves face internal conflicts and internal disunities as concerns for truth and the pursuit of truth threaten community identity and institutional integrity. I am grateful to these students for agreeing to lead us in a consideration of these subjects this evening. The resolution to be debated tonight reads as follows: Disunity among Christians is the greatest obstacle to the work of the church. It's important that you know that these students have been given this topic. They're not necessarily experts in it, though this is certainly the sort of conversation we often have at JAF. Our JAF is not per se a program in ecclesiology. Significantly, you should know that they received this resolution at the very beginning of this semester. They were divided into two groups by Dr. Evelyn Harper and myself, and they've done all their research and other work independently of us. In fact, I and my co-director, Professor Evelyn Harper, have done virtually nothing. So we will be as surprised and as interested as any of you in what we hear tonight. It's also important to say that they are not necessarily arguing for positions that they personally hold. Maybe they do, or maybe they don't, or maybe their views have changed over this semester. But I encourage you to come back on Thursday as part of the symposium events when they will have a chance to talk a little more personally and informally about the process and about their own views. The symposium schedule came out today. You can find there the time and the location for that event. For tonight, this is an exercise in oratory. Who is able to put the best face on a position? Let me go over the format and say a little bit about your role, because the audience has a very important role to play in the events this evening. Our debate is highly structured in the Oxford style, with alternating statements that are time limited, and you should have received a program when you came in. We will begin with an opening statement by the pro team, and then a rebuttal from the con team, and this will continue in sequence. Joanna Wells is here as our timekeeper who will ensure that nobody goes over time. Okay. Once we get through all the statements and all the rebuttals, there will be some time for questions from the audience. And we will have some mics floating around, and I will call upon people who have questions to raise. I would just ask that your question be succinct, not a long comment, and directed towards one team or to the other. Then there will also be time for the two teams to ask questions of one another if there's something they think hasn't been addressed or if they want to weigh in on another point. At the very end of the debate, we will be asking both teams to leave the room, and then you will all vote. And you'll be voting on which team made the most compelling case for its position. And this is very important. We're not asking you to vote on what you actually think about the resolution. Rather, we're asking you sort of to step outside yourself and consider who made the most compelling case for their side. And so this is a little challenging. You should not be influenced by other things, like who's in your dorm, or who's on your basketball team, or who's your roommate, or whatever. Rather, the quality of the argument is what we're looking at. So this is actually a vital part. This is vital. It shows proper respect. They put a lot of effort into researching and putting together their arguments, and they're expecting you all to put effort into listening and deciding who made the best case for their position. During this debate, I encourage you to think of it less like basketball and more like golf. So as they come up and as they give their statements and rebuttals, if you would please hold your applause until the very end, and then we'll give them a huge hand as they go out, and then once again as we announce tonight's winner. And then finally, I'd ask you to really listen and not be technologically distracted. So now is the time to silence and put away your phones, turn off your social media, and if you see someone in the course of the evening pulling out their phone, we're relying on you to appropriately shame them and say, "What are you doing?" That's the sort of thing we're looking for. After the debate, you can tweet to your heart's content. But to honor the work before you, shut off everything but your mind. Let me introduce them now. I will introduce them one team at a time. On the affirmative case, we have Michelle Bayard-Jargo, Maisie Jefferson, Johnny Moise, Joanne Nikezi, Josh Peters, and Grace Sullivan, and the team was led by Josh Peters. On the negative case, we have Mario Aguirre, Emily Butler, Lee Schulting, Liam Siegler, Megan Stevenson, Libby Trudeau, and Susan Walmuth, and the team was led by Liam Siegler and Emily Butler. Let me read the resolution once more time, and then we will turn things over to them. Disunity among Christians is the greatest obstacle to the work of the church. And we begin with the opening statement from the pro team.
For some of us in the room, church experience meant growing up in a world where leaders constantly fought. It meant arguments about church legislation and governance. It meant bitter splits about theology. And it was frustrating and discouraging. There is not a Christian here unfamiliar with disunity. Disunity has been the greatest obstacle to the work of the church in the past, and it continues to be so today. For this debate, both teams have agreed to define the church as people who profess to be Christian in a community under the Apostles' Creed, and the work of the church as love God and love others as a community of believers. Our team also defines disunity as a failure to handle differences with unity in the Spirit, based on the biblical exhortation in Ephesians 4:13 to have unity in the Spirit with the bond of peace. Note that the problem inside disunity is not difference, but the lack of peace. Firstly, disunity has been at the center of many of the church's largest failures to do their work, and not just today. The centrality of disunity in the church's shortcomings has a 2,000-year-old history going back to the Judaizing opponents Paul faced in Galatia. In the papal schism following the Avignon papacy, there were multiple popes for almost 40 years, and the subsequent division scattered the body into factions. And if the church could not agree even on whom to take orders from, how could they work as one body? How could they love others when they couldn't all love themselves? Similarly, the 30 Years' War was one of several wars in which millions of Christians were killed by other Christians because Catholics and Protestants were focused not on loving God and loving others, but on winning. At the source of those bloody conflicts was disunity, a refusal to accommodate difference, which brings us to the American church. What is the church known for in this nation? Dr. John Kane in the American Sociological Review writes of how in the 1800s, Protestants and Catholics brought their European tensions overseas and murdered each other, burned each other's buildings down, and cast each other as the outgroup. 100 years later, he says, Protestants still fault Catholics for the same issues, and the modern American church we are familiar with is known for mocking Pentecostals' claims of supernatural experience, for mocking non-denominationals' lukewarmth, for mocking fundamentalists' old-fashioned beliefs. Perhaps we've taken part in it. And not only do we see unbelievable disunity, but even a complacency about it. Dr. Christina Cleveland says in her book, Disunity in Christ, quote, "These days, Christians can easily go their entire lives without spending time with those who are different from them," end quote. Group polarization is poison to what the Lord intended for his bride, one bride composed of one body with parts in harmony with each other in the Spirit. Is the church, in the present or the past, known for harmony in the Spirit? Second, disunity is the greatest obstacle to the work of the church, and not just because of the sheer magnitude of its destruction, but also because it is inherently part of how work is stopped. Internally, as a socio-political organization, the introduction of disunity can only mean the introduction of harm. Gordon students certainly know that. The church fights with themselves over the issue of the ordination of women, over race relations, over building accessibility concerns, over the treatment of LGBT Christians. The church has shown us disunity manifested. Externally, however, attacks on the church are in vain when we fight with the Lord's strength. Every Christian believes in the empowerment of the Almighty Holy Spirit to fight our battles. When the church stands in unity with Christ, the gates of hell will not prevail. So the greatest obstacle lies not from without, but from within. If the church's ability to handle external threats is marked by their internal unity in Christ, and if the largest internal issues of the church are rooted in disunity, then disunity among Christians is the greatest obstacle to the work of the church. Finally, disunity among Christians keeps them fighting about what their work actually is. If they cannot handle differences in love, there is some misalignment to God's will, a misalignment from which comes the most severe, even fatal consequence of disunity. The church absolutely cannot move in the same direction. How can they love others when they're arguing about what that means for homosexual Christians? When they fight over how involved we should be in sustainable development? When they have 1,000 different plans for evangelism? When they fight about how contemporary to make their music? How can the church move forward when they do not agree on what forward is? Consider a ship in which the captain tells the crew where to go, but instead of turning to him in thunderstorms, they fight about what he might have meant. One person moves the wheel this way, one person hoards the compass, and one person is bitterly condemning the whole situation, and perhaps they eventually make it to their destination, but they were off course the entire time. Paul rebuked the Corinthian church, "When you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you." If the Lord would rebuke the Corinthian church for division, how much more we must rebuke a global church of 2 billion people? The testimony of the wars and the fights and the splits actively works against us after they happen. The church is known for its disunity, and that's heartbreaking. For hundreds of years, the church has been splitting over and over and over again, and what was a great tree bearing good fruit has become tiny pieces of kindling for the enemy to set aflame. Difference is beautiful, but when the church lacks the ability to love amid difference, far too many issues arise. Disunity's presence in internal issues, its role in defense against external harm, and its centrality in the fights defining the work of the church show us clearly that disunity among Christians is the greatest obstacle to the work of the church. Thank you.
In the book of Philippians, Paul prayed that the Philippian church would grow in love with, quote, knowledge and all discernment, so that you may approve what is excellent and so be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, end quote. This exhortation is important for our call to pursue what glorifies Christ. A key concept to this pursuit is discernment. We are to discern. We are to discern not only the good things that we should seek, but the evil that we should avoid. This debate matters because we are discussing a subject every Christian here must discern. What is the greatest obstacle to the work of the church? The affirming team contends that disunity is the greatest obstacle to the work of the church. And they have made a number of arguments supporting their position. They have argued that it is great in magnitude, that disunity hurts how the church functions, and also how disunity hurts how the church defines its mission and its call to the world. Now, it is important to note that the burden of proof is on the affirmative team to demonstrate that disunity is the greatest obstacle. Note the word greatest, that is important. Their argument is like a chair, take away one of the legs, and the whole thing falls apart or at least becomes significantly weaker. As the negative team here tonight, we disagree with the conclusions of the affirmative team. Throughout this debate, we hope to show two things. One, that disunity is more complex than the affirming team is defining it to be. And two, there are other obstacles to the work of the church that need to be considered. And may I note, we must focus on the substance of this debate. We must focus on what the substance of what unity is. The affirmative team brought up a lot of examples, and I just want to urge the audience to take note when certain examples are being sensationalized. Today, we are not going to say that disunity is not a problem. We are simply saying that it is one of many. At the end of this debate, please carefully examine whether the chair still has all its legs. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming to our debate. To answer the question, is disunity the greatest obstacle to the work of the church, it is important to place disunity in context. I will be making three main points in this regard. Our first argument of today is that disunity is an effect rather than a cause. Disunity is an effect rather than a cause. When surveying examples of disunity throughout Christian history, you will be hard-pressed to find disunity as the only source of that conflict. Now, before I go on, it must be said that sowing dissension is certainly a sin and a significant barrier to the work of the church. We are not seeking to minimize the pain or problems that disunity brings to the church. Our goal is to put it into context. When engaging in an analysis of what disunity is, we can see disunity as an effect rather than a cause. I ask that we look at disunity just how a physician treats a patient. We must not simply look for the symptoms, but for the root of the problem. For instance, in 1 Corinthians, Paul mentions how the church is quarreling over who they follow, whether it's Paul, Apollos, or Cephas. What is the root of this conflict? This is the result of ego boosting, pride. Those in the early church were taking pride in being associated with more important people, and as a result, disunity was starting to form. Pride was the cause of this disunity. Disunity often is the effect of a root sin or an effect following efforts to follow the truth, which brings us to our next point. Our second argument is that not all disunity is unnecessary. Not all disunity is unnecessary. Though disunity is a word that has a mostly negative connotations, in both scripture and history, we see that sometimes it is necessary for the health and integrity of the work of the church. Paul, for instance, on multiple occasions, urges the church to dissociate from those in their membership who are living in sin. He writes in 1 Corinthians 5 that the church must, quote, purge the evil person from among you, end quote. In Ephesians chapter 5, he urges the church to not become partners with those who practice sin. Paul even did this in his own ministry when he divided Hymenaeus and Alexander from the church for blasphemy in 1 Timothy chapter 1. As expressed in 2 Peter chapter 2, false prophets and false teachers have been presented since the birth of the church. Paul urges the Christians to remove them from their congregation in effort, solidifying disunity present. All throughout Scripture, you see a similar trend in 2 Thessalonians 3:6, 2 Timothy 3:5, and 2 John 10. Our second argument is that not all disunity is unnecessary. In 1 Corinthians 11, Paul recognizes that division is sometimes necessary. It is worth reading the whole passage. Quote, "For the first place, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I believe it in part, for there must be factions among you, in order that those who are genuine among you may be recognized." End quote. Paul wanted the church to unify, but he also realized that disunity would reveal the faithful among them. We learn in these passages one thing: disunity is sometimes necessary for the integrity of the church. A unified church filled with sin at its heart does not serve the work of the Lord. Our third argument is that the work of the church can still function amidst disunity. The work of the church can still function amidst disunity. Furthermore, disunity itself can work to benefit the church. As George Hegel said, truth is found neither in the thesis nor the antithesis, but in an emerged synthesis which reconciles the two. Considering this, disunity is a catalyst for change. Disunity is necessary and inevitable. These types of disunity can be characterized as diversity of thought. Diversity of thought enables the church to look closer into their beliefs and inspire to a stronger, more robust theology. Through diversity, some of the greatest theological insights were solidified, such as the rejection of Arianism, which asserted that Christ was created by the Father. In conclusion, when putting disunity into context, we learn disunity is an effect rather than a cause, that not all disunity is unnecessary, and that the work of the church can still function amongst disunity.
Our opponent has framed disunity as something that is perhaps a necessary evil, or perhaps something that is fundamentally not as harmful as it has been. But to deny this would be to deny the violence of the past. Disunity and sin, to address their point about disunity not being the root of a lot of problems in the church, but sin, disunity and sin are not interchangeable, but they are inextricably linked. There is no example of a church being united with God and then disunited with each other. The will of God for the church is unity. In Jesus' high priestly prayer, he prays that Christians may be one in him, one as him and the Father are. To deny disunity as a horrible evidence in the past would be to deny that this is Jesus' dearest wish for us. And to address the fact that sin in the church is one of the greatest obstacles, too many problems have occurred in the church that have been as a result of the disunity in dealing with sin in the church. How many times have we seen a case of something in the church, a schism, a case of sexual assault, a case of monetary distribution gone wrong, where disunity has been the cause of that schism because the church could not handle its discipline well? In addition, there is a difference between disunity and having a healthy church that can handle theological difference. Paul provides a model for this healthy, unified church with diversity of opinion in Romans 14, when he says, "Therefore, let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, make up your mind not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in the way of a brother or sister."
Good evening, Gordon College. Firstly, I'd like to point out that the opposing side has mentioned Arianism, which falls outside of Orthodox Christianity, which we have defined prior to this debate. Therefore, it cannot be considered as disunity among Christians. Disunity, as we have defined it, is when Christians cannot handle differences in love of the Spirit. We see this across denominations, within denominations, and in local churches. One famous example of a disunified congregation is Mars Hill Church. Mars Hill was a multi-site megachurch based in Seattle, Washington, founded in 1996. this church was hugely influential. At its peak, it had 15 locations across 4 states, over 200,000 sermon views each week on their broadcasts, and over 12,000 people in weekly attendance. Mars Hill fell in 2014 when the co-founder and pastor, Pastor Mark Driscoll, left after refusing to agree to a reconciliation plan made by the elder board. Its locations became independent, shut down, and joined other congregations. Thousands were left with no church and traumatized from their years there. Mars Hill, or more specifically, Pastor Driscoll and other leaders there, had contempt for the rest of Christianity. STEM students, or anybody here who's taken the scientific enterprise, would know that if one population in a larger population is isolated, it allows mutations and defects in the subgroup to proliferate and become isolated from the larger population. Due to disunity with the rest of Christianity, Pastor Mark lacked other voices in American evangelicalism. Furthermore, the insular leadership he created lacked accountability to correct his abusive behavior and the aggressive, militaristic culture he fostered. Mars Hill had many problems, some of them independent of disunity, but disunity is the dirty filter by which all those other problems pass through. For example, at times he simply refused to submit to other voices in the American church. When asked to submit to voices such as John Piper or Tim Keller, he said, "I can't listen to them. Quote, my church is bigger than his," end quote. There's an element of prideful isolation here that stems from disunity. If iron sharpens iron, then the church can benefit. If not, this local church remains redundant to its myopic perspectives, inhibiting its growth and eventually obstructing work. Mark displayed bullying behavior towards other leaders. Any questioning of his leadership was met with scorn, shaming, and possible removal from the church. In 2007, two elders were questioning revisions to the bylaws that centralized leadership in Mars Hill. They were fired, their families were removed from the church, and the detailing of their firing was not made public. 2 days later, Mark, in a statement, said, "There is a pile of dead bodies behind the Mars Hill bus, and by God's grace, it'll be a mountain by the time we're done. We either get on the bus or get run over by the bus." By dead bodies, Pastor Mark means the people he fires for calling out his sin, the people hurt in the name of expanding his ministry. So what is the effect of all this disunity? At the heart of disunity is miscommunication among members. At Mars Hill, the leadership did not communicate the church's finances effectively within its walls. Towards the end of the church's life, there were budget cuts, layoffs, and the church spent copious amounts of money on infrastructure. Meanwhile, $200,000 in church funds were diverted to Pastor Mark's book marketing to make him a New York Times best-selling author. This was covered up and excused. Pastor Mark took from his flock to further his own personal ministry. In this disunified environment, he escaped proper rebuke. Another effect that we would be silly to not consider is the emotional and spiritual trauma and financial struggles of congregants in the aftermath of this church's disintegration. Some pastors were so burnt out they did not go back to pastoring. Some still get panic attacks when thinking about their experience at this church, which was filled with conflict and disunity. Some staff members struggle to get jobs after Mars Hill fell because the employers in the area are so hurt by the experience, and they do not want to be associated with that. In the aftermath of the fall, people lost their spiritual home, and some hold on to bitterness and cynicism towards the church. Does this sound familiar to anybody? In summary, disunity with the rest of Christianity and within Mars Hill was the center and key ingredient in Mars Hill's problems. Maybe the fate of Mars Hill would have been different if the church had been connected to other church organizations or other sister congregations. But this problem is larger than just this church. It's a story echoed in many local churches. The church should not be disunified. Disunity allows for sin and destruction to wreak havoc on individuals. Sure, splitting may bring an end to some of that conflict. Some of this splitting might result in healthier congregations, but at what cost? So when we say that something is the greatest obstacle, do we mean greatest in scale, depth? Disunity fits both of those criteria, and it is the hardest to solve. Thank you.
We agree that disunity has harmful effects. We do not deny that disunity has caused much pain and hurt within the church. We agree with these things. However, we move forward and we ask you to consider the bigger picture. Disunity is an effect rather than a cause. The Mars Hill example that our opposing team brought up was caused primarily, as they said, by miscommunication. We further add that pride and leadership, toxic leadership at that, was the root of this painful experience for many church members. So we ask you to consider the bigger picture. Disunity has harmful effects. We are not denying this. But, as we will continue to demonstrate, addressing an illness doesn't require us to just look at the symptoms. We have to look at the root causes of the illness. And in our investigation of this proposition, we believe that it would be wise to consider the bigger picture. It would be wise to see the root of disunity. In considering the greatest obstacle to the work of the church, we contend that disunity is an effect. Simply an effect, a horrible effect. Further, we also add that disunity is necessary. Though horrible it may be, disunity provides the grounds for disagreement. Thesis met with an antithesis produces a greater synthesis. Thank you.
So far, we have established that the concepts of unity and disunity and their effects on the church are much more complicated than they may appear at first glance. Neither is entirely good or entirely bad, pointing us to the conclusion that it's not as clear-cut as simply claiming disunity to be the greatest obstacle. If not disunity, though, what is the greatest obstacle? Well, how can we determine this? Is there a way to measure or calculate what obstacle has had the greatest negative effect? We submit to you that doing so would be incredibly challenging. What really is there for us to quantify to determine which is a worse obstacle? Can someone really prove that disunity is the worst? I encourage you to keep that in mind as we continue discussing this issue. With that being said, we have compiled a few other obstacles that the church faces and proposed them as equal to, if not greater than, disunity. Pride, bad theology, decline in church membership, and persecution. First, let's consider pride. I could simply propose to you that sin in itself is the greatest obstacle. However, focusing on pride gives us something more tangible. Traditionally, pride has been seen as the greatest of all sins, the one every other sin stems from. It was pride that led Adam and Eve to eat of the fruit in Genesis, wanting to be like God. Pride leads us to decide to do our own thing instead of striving to follow God's will. If dealing with pride, the church will struggle to discern the will of God and decide to act on its own judgment. How hard is it to do the work of the Lord if the church is relying on its own strength and abilities? Couldn't pride be the greatest obstacle to the work of the church? Second, bad theology, which is anything that goes against how God has revealed himself in the Bible. One example of bad theology is legalism, when Christians attempt to achieve righteousness through performing good works. Legalism deters many people from joining the church and causes many to leave it, especially severely affecting the younger generation. Growing up in a church environment that is more concerned with the length of your shorts or the music you listen to than the state of your heart and relationship with the Lord has caused many young Christians to reject the church. Couldn't bad theology be the greatest obstacle to the work of the church? Next, decline in church membership. In 2017, a study conducted showed that 66% of young adults questioned said that they stopped attending church for at least a year between the ages of 18 and 22. Some reasons include starting work and college, disillusionment with church leadership, not feeling the need for God, abuse, and corruption. Young people are the future of the church. How will it continue to function in the coming years if the majority of young Christians will have already left? Couldn't decline in church membership be the greatest obstacle to the work of the church? Finally, consider with me persecution as a major obstacle to the work of the church. Historically, Christians have faced huge amounts of persecution, and although the church has persevered through it with the help of God, it has certainly hindered its work. Capturing, imprisoning, and murdering of church leaders has left Christians to struggle without guidance in these horrible times. Living in the U.S. today, it is easy for us to view persecution as primarily a tragedy of the past. However, that is simply not the case. Currently, more than 340 million Christians face high levels of persecution and discrimination because of their faith. And the number of Christians killed for their faith had a 60% increase from 2020 to 2021. When taking into account both the historic and current instances of persecution, I encourage you to consider, couldn't persecution be the greatest obstacle to the work of the church? The affirmative side will try to draw you in with individual examples and instances where disunity has hurt the church. We are not here to say that they are wrong. Disunity certainly is a big obstacle. However, we ask you to consider the bigger picture and decide, is it truly the greatest? Keep in mind, pride, bad theology, decline in church membership, and persecution. We submit to you that these are all also major obstacles to the work of the church. Which is the greatest? Is one the greatest?
The negative team has proposed sin, specifically the sin of pride, as the most significant obstacle to the work of the church. However, sin, a rebellion against God, and therefore a separation from God, has always been humanity's greatest tragedy and worst demise. Sin is the reason Jesus came to the earth in the first place, to pay the price for our rebellion and to restore our relationship and disunity with God. After his death and resurrection, Jesus established the church to continue his ministry until he returns. The church exists because of sin and its consequences. As we wait for his return, we must ask ourselves how human sin manifests itself in the church, what inhibits us from pursuing the work of Christ laid out for us in the meantime, as we wait for him. Disunity among Christians is a tangible manifestation of the brokenness of this world. Sin will end when Jesus comes back, but so will the work of the church. We have to know how the brokenness of sin is tangibly presented among the body of believers so that we might intentionally fight against it. The greatest tangible presentation of sin is the division it causes among the people of God. It inhibits the ability of the church to intentionally and in love pursue Christ together. When this disunity becomes the focal point in a church, its work to love God and love others naturally takes a back seat. The negative team has also presented persecution as a potential significant obstacle to the work of the church. However, we must remind ourselves that Jesus has promised that the gates of hell, no external forces, will prevail against the church that he has established. He will sustain it through all obstacles. Thank you.
All right, we now have some time for Q&A from the audience. And you're welcome to raise your hands and be recognized. We have two volunteers with mics who will come find you. Just to remind you, we're looking for specific, relatively succinct questions which are directed at one team or the other. And if you could, please also introduce yourself very briefly when you stand up to ask your question. So, who has a question for either team? Right down here, Jay.
Hello, my name is Jay. I am a JAF alumnus from the year that was the past one. And my question is to the con team. So you argue that disunity is an effect, not the cause, and therefore not the greatest obstacle to the work of the church. But does being an effect necessarily disqualify it from being the greatest obstacle? What if disunity is indeed the effect, not the cause, but is the common denominator found in every failure of the work of the church?
I think it's an interesting question, and I think when we're talking about examples where there's disunity, like say sexuality, for instance, we don't look at the churches dividing about that and be like, well, the issue must be that they just don't like each other. Like we ask questions like, like it's a theological question. Like it's a question about love, and really at the heart, there's those penetrating questions behind division. And I would say not all division is the same. The Mars Hill example that they brought up, that was the result of toxic leadership and domineering. And I would say it would be very different than a church splitting over an issue that they consider theologically important. So I would say not all disunity is created equal. Not all of it has the same intentions. And so I don't think you can say that there's a common denominator.
We have, Maddie.
Hello. My name is Maddie, and I'm also a JAF alum from last year. My question is also for the negative team. As Jay pointed out, you have multiple times identified that disunity is an effect rather than a cause. And that we should focus on the disease rather than the symptoms. But in your follow-up statement, you also discussed decrease in church attendance, and I was wondering if you could explain how that can be considered as a cause rather than an effect.
Thank you for your question. I don't think that every obstacle that we've listed is necessarily a root problem that causes disunity. It can. I think that people leaving the church can come from disunity, but I did list other reasons, and there are a lot of reasons why people are leaving the church and the church membership is declining. So I don't think that it can be completely linked between disunity and people leaving the church. I think there's a wide variety of reasons why that would be the case.
Very, very tough.
Hi, I'm Marley Grace. I have a question for the pro team, specifically in relation to the conversation with Mars Hill and sensationalism. How do we determine what it looks like? What's the difference between disunity and difference in churches such as that?
So for our main argument is that disunity is defined as not handling differences well. Like differences, whether it's theological differences, differences in political opinions, things like that, those can be handled through the filter of unity in the spirit. So without handling these differences in love, that's when disunity occurs, and that's when all the effects of that happens. Oh, you have another question?
Sorry, can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Awesome. So in the case of Mars Hill and other big mega churches that we have seen come to light that have had issues of disunity, it has taken years and years to be able to come to that disunity. So is it actually disunity, or is it just a misunderstanding of theological practices and conversation?
Our team presents the idea that disunity among Christians actually stems from, it's more than just disunity amongst each other, because we are supposed to move as a body. We're supposed to move in a unified direction in a time and a pace. And really, disunity among Christians is actually just disunity with the will of God. none of these megachurches would have the problems they had if everyone in the leadership, every member of the congregation was together, unified in God's will for that church. Now, of course, naturally, we all fall short, and so we create disunity because we have our own ideas and we are all sinful. But none of these problems, even a megachurch, logistically, just because it's difficult in a practical sense, doesn't mean that it's theoretically impossible for them to work well if they were all unified together under God's will.
Furthermore, the problems at Mars Hill resulted from a lack of unity within the church structure. So the leadership at Mars Hill was very centralized. It was centralized around Mark Driscoll and the several elders that were around him, and there was not a robust elder board that could hold people accountable, and the church itself remained separate from larger Christianity as a whole. Like, they made their own music, they had their own seminary, they were largely separate from the rest of Christianity, so that kept a lot of accountability that could have hindered the problems that were happening there.
Kenny over here.
Hello, I am Kenny, a JAF alum from the year before Jay and Maddie previously, 2 years previous. Oftentimes, this is for the affirmative team. Oftentimes when I hear calls for unity, it can sound very good on the surface, but mask a sort of submission of the wronged party to injustice, if that makes sense. Like, for example, in the case of Mars Hill that we've been going back to, if everyone had just gone along with the leader's will, like everyone had just gone with what he'd been saying, that's a unified church. They're all going with what he wants. That's unification. But I don't think that's a healthy unification. I don't think you guys would propose that that's a good idea. So how would you, you said to go shortly, so I'm going to try to wrap it up. How do you distinguish between a healthy and an unhealthy unification, and how do you resolve unhealthy unification without disunity, if that makes sense?
Thank you so much for your question. It all goes back to how we are defining disunity, and disunity is a failure to handle differences in the unity of spirit. So the Holy Spirit is within us, and since the Spirit is within us, we are agreeing in the same spirit. So yeah, thank you.
Question down below.
Thank you, Christian. Hello. So this question's to the affirmative. At one point, you used the logic to a point that the negative team raised regarding the topic of persecution, where you offered that the biblical promise of God's providence in light of this persecution seems to negate it as a threat. And I'm, I suppose, curious that if the same argument could not be leveraged, against disunity in their church, where if the biblical promise that we have for unity as a body of believers in heaven cannot then be taken to liken it all to an even playing field.
Right. So yes, Jesus promises that the gates of hell will not prevail against his church. His bride will be ready for him when he gets here. But why would we ever hesitate to identify and call out the areas that the church is not performing in Christ's perfect design? We will not do it perfectly, but why would we ever hesitate to call out the areas where we are not following him? The question then becomes, what is the greatest obstacle to the work of the church produced by the brokenness we see? And the example of persecution, although a significant obstacle to the work of the church, does not match the scope of disunity that we have laid out. It does not match how far-reaching disunity is, because, like we said in our second argument, how internally unified the church is helps it better handle external threats such as persecution.
if disunity is not addressed, persecution becomes a greater obstacle. But because of that, it points back to the fact that disunity would be the greater obstacle in that case.
Teddy Max, right here.
Hi, my name is Teddy Max. I am not a JAF alum, but congrats to all of you for doing this. My question is for the negative team. You state that disunity is a necessary evil, and at the beginning of the debate, I believe it was Josh Peters that articulated the definition of the work of the church as being loving God and loving others. And so I'm wondering if you can further articulate why this love requires disunity.
Thank you for asking that question. And that is one I've thought of a lot. So in looking at disunity, looking at unity, you'll see, and they highlighted very well, a lot of the verses and admonitions in Scripture, like we have to unify, we should be of one mind. But you'll also see Paul when talking about disunity, there are two instances where it is important for the church to push somebody out. That is when they are practicing in sin unrepentantly and professing to be a believer. And two, when somebody is preaching something that is contrary to the doctrine that in the gospel of Christ that is undermining what they are doing. And Paul has very strong words for church leaders, says they need to go. What that ends up happening in the real world is people will profess to believe certain things that person in the church said, and then there will be a split. So I don't like, when we never said that it's a necessary evil, but we did say that I would rather say it's a necessary reality, that we live in a broken world, that uniformity is not the goal at the end of the day. At the end of the day, the goal is how, as a body, do we love Christ in the midst of so much brokenness? And unfortunately, and as Paul even said, and we brought up the verse, like he expects there to be disunity in some of the churches that he's ministering to because it will reveal who's genuine, and we'll keep going. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Right over here, yeah.
Hi, I have a question for the negative team. So you said that one of the possible obstacles was bad theology, but if the church isn't unified, how can it discern what is bad theology? Because one group will say that's bad theology, and the other group will say, no, it's right.
Thanks for the question. I don't think on this side of heaven we could ever all come to the same agreement on all issues. But that wasn't our intention in pointing out bad theology. I guess when we say bad theology, we're not saying theological difference, because there are theological differences that we in the church don't consider heretical. But when we brought up legalism, there is theology and ways of interpreting Scripture that hurt people. I mean, Mars Hill was an example of the church was unified around a theology that hurt people, like a definition of biblical manhood that was domineering and oppressive, and conception of headship that ended up hurting women and wives and how they viewed themselves. Like, that is bad theology. And I would argue that bad theology was the reason why Mars Hill fell. I listened to the podcast, really great podcast, totally recommend it. But if you look at bad theology in the church, not difference, but theology that undermines the gospel. Antinomianism was one the church has historically had to deal with. You'll see that it ends up hurting people, and people end up leaving the church because they have a poor conception of like what the gospel is and what Christ is. So when we say that that is a significant obstacle, that's what we mean by it. So I hope that answers your question.
One or two more questions. You have a question?
I do.
Oh, okay.
Hello, my name is Christian. I am also a JAF alum. My question is for the negative side, actually. Though it does kind of span both teams. Neither side brought up the Great Schism of 1054 or the Reformation, where three of the biggest traditions of Christianity have found their conception: Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and Protestantism. There was a lot of destruction there, and a lot of division really found its home there. As the negative team, how would you address such great division on a global scale in three separate instances?
Thank you so much, Ben Christian, for your question. I just want to make sure I'm understanding it. You're asking, what is our response to the schisms that have happened in history?
Yes, they're huge, and they've caused a lot of damage and a lot of disunity that we've talked about today can really find its origin starting there. Those seem pretty big to ignore, and yet no one's brought them up. I'm curious as to why.
So, great question. Like we have pressed several times, none of us are negating the effect that disunity has had and how painful and hurtful it can be. These schisms came out of theological differences, and through those studies, people came to different conclusions and they decided to split. That's a summary of what happened. As our team, we wanted to focus on more contemporary issues, which is why we didn't bring it up in the debate. And then also I'm going to pass it on to Susan.
So I think that when you look in the past, yes, it's something that happened and it was caused by disunity, but in the end it winds up, there are some examples where they're trying to work as a unified, and they don't let the fact that they had disagreements, because there's going to be disagreements in the church since no one knows what God really wants, because it's not like any of us can be like completely sure. And even in like March 2020, this year, there was a service where there was a whole bunch of different denominations that meant to celebrate the different diversity that they had, and to be like, yes, we're not together, but we understand that we have differences and we want to work together for the same goal because we believe in the same God. And so we kind of talked about it, but we didn't have enough time for it. So that's what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of just to what Susan would say, we would recognize that that is a schism and a lot of really bad things happen. But as Susan was pointing out, also a lot of good has happened amidst that disunity. So it's not as black and white. It's not as complex. Like, we wouldn't say that disunity was the main problem that we see in the schisms. Like, there's a lot of substantive theological issues. There's a lot of issues that had to do with context and culture, socioeconomics. So it's not so clear-cut. And I think Emily said pretty well why we didn't use it. We chose some more contemporary examples, but thanks for bringing it up.
I know there's still more questions out there, but you're going to have to corner them in a hallway or something and try to get those questions answered. What we need to do now is to give the teams a few minutes to ask questions of each other. We'll take 5 minutes, and we'll begin with the con side, and then go to the pro side until those 5 minutes have elapsed. So a question from the negative side.
Hi. Multiple times you've mentioned pride in conjunction with your argument, and you are acknowledging that it is the pride of individual believers that lead to the brokenness. And I'm just wondering, how can we address the disunity without considering the root cause?
That's because disunity is the root cause. Any sin, doesn't matter what it is, any sin finds its root in disunity from the will of God. Every Christian, ideally, is meant to follow God's plan for them in their direction and their pace and time. Sin results when we work against that because of our own nature, but sin is really just a misalignment. It is disunity with the will of God, and that disunity with the will of God itself breeds disunity among Christians. There is no sin that is divorced from other people. All sin is relational to other people and to God. Disunity among Christians and sin and disunity from the will of God are all caused by the same thing. It's a vicious, vicious cycle.
Yeah. So in response to one of the questions from the audience, you said maybe disunity is not maybe a necessary evil, but it is a necessary reality. Given that disunity causes schisms, wars, hatred among different polarized groups in America today, given that Jesus calls for unity in John 14, John 15, John 17, Matthew 12, are you saying that disunity is not evil?
We've said multiple times that disunity and the disunity that is the result of dissension and sin, in effect, it is evil, obviously. We're called to unify. But in saying that disunity is negative, we're not saying that all disunity is same, that the reasons for that, like war, it is conflict, but not all wars have the same justifications. Not all wars have the same roots. Some are rooted in what some might say it might be a just war. There's just war theory for that very reason. And some, like Vladimir Putin's invasion in Ukraine, unprompted, that is evil. But you can just look at the effect or look at the aftermath and be like, man, the problem was that they just weren't getting along. But that's not going to solve any problem. In saying that sometimes disunity is necessary, it's a recognition that this world is ugly and complex, and sometimes there are reasons for why bad things happen that might be good.
So it sounds that there's a consistency with you kind of saying that sin and disunity are the same or equivalent. However, what about other vices? Couldn't pride also be considered a sin, especially as the root of all evil?
As I said before, sin is why there is a church in the first place. It is why Jesus came, and it is why he came to reestablish our relationship with God. However, when Jesus comes back, the work of the church will end. So we must ask ourselves, what are the obstacles to the work of the church to love God and love others that we tangibly see and can fight against on this side of heaven?
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned that external threats like persecution could inhibit the work of the church. Then couldn't we actually see this as opportunities for the united church to be the light to the world?
I think that you are right with that. I think that's something that we are stressing in this entire debate is the fact that nothing is as black and white as we may want it to appear. So persecution is a huge obstacle, but it can lead to some good coming out of it. It can lead to people uniting, but it can also lead to really hindering the work of the church. And so just as with unity, disunity, persecution, all of these things, there is a lot of more complexity than what we might want to see right away on first glance.
All right. Let's move now to our concluding statements. We will begin with the pro side.
Good evening, Gordon College. A house divided cannot stand. The affirmative case has methodically demonstrated with why disunity through and through is the greatest obstacle to the work of the church. Not just an obstacle, but the greatest. This case has looked deep into the heart of the church, examined the source of its divine work, and concluded that the church is the vessel for God's all-loving, all-unifying will on this side of heaven. To participate in the church as a community is to participate in the corporate body of Christ, a body that is designed to move in the direction of God's will with the intensity of God's will. Become disunited with either of those things and you create a recipe for disaster. You lose sight of God's plan and you lose sight of your fellow Christian. The negative team throughout this debate has presented many examples of what might be greater obstacles to the work of the church. Unfortunately, they haven't substantiated it with any robust reasoning. They merely threw out suggestions and didn't really follow them up. The most interesting argument the negative case has made is that disunity somehow creates the conditions for the development or the progress of the church. However, this wouldn't be necessary in the first place if we were all united under God's will. Now, do not get the affirmative case wrong. The affirmative case does not present a solution to disunity, and we are not saying that unity is the solution. What we are saying, though, is that disunity among Christians is rooted in this disunity with the will of God. This misalignment is the crucial factor that sows disruption among the people. The greatest problems faced by the church in modern society and in ages past have either been caused by or magnified by disunity among Christians. The affirmative case has discussed issues of corrupt leaders and church splits. Now, these issues have been prevalent since the church's inception. When church bodies are not united, external threats leak through the cracks like a virus through broken skin. God has a will and a way. Christ has a will for the church, destined to be his hands and feet in this broken world. We would all be tuned into God's will and act in unison, then there would be no reason for disunity. But this is not possible. Disunity among Christians is ultimately a conflict over the interpretation of God's will. It is impossible to know for certain what God's precise will is. However, what we do know is that when we are disunited, it must mean that some parts of the body are not united with God's will. Realistically, we are all wrong for one reason or another. But our inability to solve differences blinds us and makes us incapable of fulfilling God's unified vision for the church. Any deviance from God's will must always obstruct the work of the church, and there is no greater mistake than to work against God's will. Disunity among Christians is the same as disunity with the will of God, because humans are relational creatures. Humans relate to one another and they relate to God. Sin is not the same as disunity, but sin and disunity form one another and they create a cycle, this never-ending cycle that cannot be solved realistically on this side of heaven. Disunity may be an unfortunate reality that we face in the world today, but we must ask ourselves, of all the problems that are caused by sin, what can we fight in the here and now? Gordon College, a house divided cannot stand. When we are disunited with each other, sin leaks through the cracks, and the enemy finds its way to play us for fools. Our external circumstances shake us and they break us. When we are disunited, we lose sight of what it means to rebuke one another in love, and every issue becomes a potential schism and a war. When we are disunited, our internal circumstances raise a hot fever that incapacitates the body, paralyzing progress towards the church's mission. If disunity wasn't the greatest obstacle faced by the church, why did Jesus, in his prayer for believers preceding his darkest hour in the Garden of Gethsemane, say, "I pray for those who will believe in me through my disciples' message, that all of them may be one, Father, just as you are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me." Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. We wanted to once again thank everyone for attending tonight's debate, as well as the opposing side for pouring their hearts into this discussion just as much as we did. Tonight, we have sought to demonstrate that disunity among Christians is not the greatest obstacle to the work of the church. Note, among Christians, which is something that the affirmative team seems to be forgetting. It is not disunity with God. The burden of proof has fallen on the affirmative side to show that disunity is by far the greatest, most insurmountable obstacle. And our opponent has made several arguments that function primarily as the legs of their chair. However, they're relying on emotional situations rather than focusing on the debate as a whole. Moreover, if one of these legs are taken away, we hope that you, as the audience, will seriously question the merit claims. One of the arguments that they have brought up is how disunity is hurting the church because there is no unity in spirit. However, dissension and being able to be of one mind and independent is not, dissension and being able to be of one mind is pretty good, but it's not all division is in the church, it relies on this breakup of agreement. When we look at all the different examples that we brought up, we can see that the issue isn't church leaders, it isn't disunity, it is a bunch of different things. Complete unity among Christians is not the answer. The Mars Hill example that you brought up was the result of uniformity, not disunity, and moreover, there was so much brokenness in the church due to several other issues. We propose that disunity is not a cause, but rather an effect. You've heard us say that several times. We should not be satisfied with saying that disunity is the biggest obstacle to the work of the church, nor should we be settling for specific issues, though painful they have been. We submit to you that we cannot ignore the other egregious problems that the church faces. One of them has been pride. We established that pride has been an ever-consuming issue, and the affirmative side has agreed with this through many of their examples. We view this issue to be paramount to our agreed-upon definition of the work of the church. We cannot love God and love others when we are vying for personal greatness. Disunity with God is human pride. The fall of Adam and Eve, pride. Disunity with the will of God is not the same thing as disunity in the church. Another example that we brought up is legalism. Legalism falls under the purview of bad theology, and as theologian John Piper says, bad theology will eventually hurt people and dishonor God in proportion to its badness. When the church attempts to control the outward posture of its people, it serves to do more damage than good under the umbrella of unity. And when considering the church worldwide, legalism as a form of bad theology is extremely prevalent and affects many people. Another example we brought up is the decline in church membership. Church attendance has been on the decline over the past several years. If people give up on attending, how is the work of the church supposed to flourish? According to our definition of the work of the church, it is to love God and love others as a community of believers, a community. Without the community aspect, the work cannot flourish. And as Libby has pointed out, there are several reasons that people are leaving the church that has nothing to do with disunity. Another example that we brought up is persecution, which the affirmative side has claimed that it does not match the scope that disunity brings. But how can they say this when millions of people are being killed? No one can deny the devastating effect that persecution has had on the church. Matthew 10:22 says, "And you will be hated by my name." Sorry, I'm going to say that again. "And you will be hated by all for my name's sake." Ever since the beginning, Jesus' followers have been hunted and eradicated, and this problem has not gone away. Millions of Christians all around the world are continually being displaced and persecuted for their beliefs. This is a huge impeding force against the work of the church. Again, not through disunity. Unity and disunity must be understood in proper context. Considering these points, we urge you to negate the resolution. The affirmative team has not succeeded in proving that disunity is the greatest obstacle to the work of the church. Disunity is a problem, but is not the biggest nor the hardest to overcome. Thank you.
Well, now is the time to vote. So as we ask our teams to exit stage right, let's give them a hand of applause for job well done. Okay, let me reiterate that you are voting not on the basis of your affinity to particular people, and not even on your opinion of the matter at hand, but rather on who made the most compelling case for their position. So really think about it. Don't be swayed by anyone sitting around you. Then if you raise your hands, we have counters positioned who do the count. So I'm going to start with the pro team. If you think the pro team, the affirmative team, made the most compelling case, please raise your right hand and keep it high. All set? Okay, you can lower your hands. And now if you think the negative case made the strongest case, if the negative side made the strongest case, please raise your hand and keep it high. And you should be the different people, like don't vote for both. You can lower your hands. Well, we have a winner to announce. It has been a tremendous amount of work for both teams, and so I have to congratulate you. It was one of our more close votes. I'm happy to say. Before I announce it, again, let me thank you all for coming. Thank you to the JAF alumni who showed up, also the next year's JAF cohort who are also present, also family members who are here cheering on. It's very good to have you all here. The results. The pro team received 47 votes, and the con team received 41 votes, so the win goes to the affirmative team. Thank you all for coming. Have a good night.